0 o'clock to 0:37. Today, Australia ranks among the wealthiest, most highly developed nations on Earth. Its major cities Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane, Perth, Adelaide frequently appear in the top 10 of global livability indexes. Australians enjoy excellent healthcare, education, and some of the world's highest wages. Well, if you want to find out more, then join me today as we take a journey back in time to explore how Australia went from a barren, inhospitable desert wasteland to a contemporary global powerhouse. 117 to 27. Before European settlement, the land we know today as Australia had been inhabited by the Aboriginal peoples for over 65,000 years. These societies were not static or unchanging. However, rather, they were dynamic and sophisticated. For example, there were hundreds of distinct Aboriginal nations across the continent with their own languages and customs. And Aboriginal Australians had a deep knowledge of the land, including its plants and animals. They used this knowledge to develop sophisticated hunting and gathering techniques, as well as to create tools and weapons from natural materials. Despite this sophistication, however, when Europeans arrived, they would quickly come to dominate the land, and the Aboriginal Australians would be effectively erased. And this is because the first Europeans to make it to Australia were not explorers or settlers, but rather British convicts. You see, in the late 18th century, Britain was looking for a place to send its convicts, people who had broken the law but weren't quite deserving of a death sentence. And so it chose Australia, a remote and inhospitable land down under. However, before we get to the convicts, let's go back even further to see how Europeans even discovered this far-flung penal colony. 227-415. As mentioned, the first Europeans to reach Australia were Dutch explorers in the early 1600s, including Willem Janszoon, who charted much of the northern coastline. He named the land New Holland after the Dutch East India Company, which had hoped to profit from trade in the region. However, despite the Dutch having reached Australia first, they didn't pursue colonization, mainly due to the fact that the land seemed too remote and not commercially appealing enough. This would change, however, with the British. The British had long been aware of the existence of Australia, thanks to Dutch reports. But it was until Captain James Cook sailed along the eastern coast in 1768 to 1779 that they took serious notice. On April 1770. He landed in an area known as Botany Bay and claimed it for the British Crown, naming it New South Wales. Soon thereafter, Britain began planning its first penal colony in Australia, 630-6712. While planning for Australia was underway, Britain lost its American colonies during the American Revolutionary War. This made establishing a penal colony in Australia all the more important because Britain needed somewhere to send its convicts. In 1787, the first fleet of 11 ships carrying over 1,500 convicts arrived off the coast of Australia. They had travelled for months and scurvy and other diseases had taken their toll. Upon arriving in Botany Bay, however, they found it unsuitable for establishing a settlement. After exploring further north, they found a better location in Sydney Cove, where the colony of New South Wales was established in 1788. 855 to 1042. Initially, relations between the British and the Indigenous Australians were good. The British needed the Indigenous people's help to survive in the unfamiliar environment. However, as the colony grew, tensions began to rise. The British colonists brought with them diseases that devastated the indigenous population. For example, smallpox killed roughly half the Aboriginal people in the Sydney region. Moreover, the two cultures were very different, and there were often misunderstandings. Additionally, as the colony expanded, the British began taking indigenous land without compensation. Eventually, this would lead to violent conflict. For example, in 1790, an Aboriginal man was killed by a British soldier, sparking a rebellion. The British responded by killing several Aboriginal men and women, including the man who had raised the alarm. Things would eventually settle down, but relations between the two groups would never be the same. To improve relations, the British tried a number of things, including hiring Indigenous people as interpreters and missionaries, setting aside land for Aboriginal people, and even taking some Aboriginal children back to Britain for education. One of these interpreters was a man named Benelong, who played a key role in improving relations between the two groups. He learned English and taught the British about Aboriginal culture. However, despite these efforts, relations between the two groups remained tense. There were continued conflicts over land and resources, and the British were still suspicious of the Aboriginal people. 1042–1408. Over the next few decades, the colony of New South Wales would grow and prosper. Agriculture and manufacturing would become important industries, and the colony would begin to export goods to Britain. Despite this prosperity, however, life was still difficult for the convicts who had been sent to Australia. They lived in poverty and were subject to harsh punishments. Many of them were able to secure their freedom after serving their sentences, but they were still seen as second-class citizens. This would all change, however, in 1851, when gold was discovered near the town of Bathurst. This triggered a massive gold rush, and grievances over representation led to the famous Eureka Stockade Rebellion in 1854. The rebels demanded the right to vote and to have a say in the government. They argued that they were being denied basic rights because they were seen as less than other Australians. The rebellion was eventually put down, but it was a significant event in Australian history. Of the 8 men put on trial for the rebellion, 5 were acquitted. This was a sign that attitudes towards convicts were beginning to change. 1408 to 1516. By the mid-19th century, the Australian colonies were becoming increasingly self-sufficient, and many of the original convicts had been pardoned or had died. The colonies also had their own governments and were responsible for their own affairs. Growing self-identity and nationalism led the 6 British colonies to federate. In 1900, Australia became a unified nation via legislation passed by the British Parliament in the United Kingdom. This legislation created a federal system of government, with power divided between the central government and the 6 state governments. The new nation was officially named the Commonwealth of Australia. However, despite this newfound unity, there was still a great deal of tension between the different colonies. For example, there was often disagreement over tariffs and trade. Nevertheless, the process of federation brought the colonies closer together and helped to create a sense of national identity. 1516 to 1835. Following federation, Australia continued to grow and develop. During World War I, Australian troops fought valiantly, most famously at Gallipoli and on the Western Front. This experience had a profound impact on the development of Australian identity. It was the first time that Australians had fought and died as a nation. It also led to the deaths of many young men and the physical and psychological trauma of those who survived. Despite the immense cost in lives and resources, Australia's participation in World War I helped to forge a new sense of national identity and unity. The war also solidified Australia's ties with Britain and other Commonwealth nations. In the years following World War I, Australia experienced significant economic and social change. The Great Depression of the 1930s had a devastating impact on the nation, but it was followed by a period of sustained economic growth after World War II. The post-war period also saw a huge increase in immigration, which helped to boost the economy and diversify the population. In the 1950s and 60s, Australia's cultural icons began to take shape, including the Sydney Opera House, which was completed in 1973 after 14 years of construction, 1835 to 1947. In the late 20th century, Australia would face a number of challenges. The 1970s oil crisis had a major impact on the economy, but the nation was able to weather the storm relatively well. In the 1980s, Australia experienced a recession, but it was followed by a period of sustained economic growth. Politically, Australia shifted away from its traditional ties to Britain and closer to the United States. This was exemplified by the signing of the ANZUS Treaty in 1951, which solidified Australia's commitment to the US-led Western Alliance. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button and subscribe for more content. Thanks again for watching, and we will see you very soon in the next video.